The hall was filled with the sound of laughter, clinking dishes, and the busy footsteps of people preparing for the town's annual charity event. Every year, this small community came together to raise money for the local children's hospital. There were always stalls, decorations, food counters, and a few stage performances. Everyone was doing their bit, and the place buzzed with that warm kind of excitement that only small towns seem to have. Among the volunteers was a young woman named Lena. She wasn't a performer. This year, she'd only come to help with decorations and to manage the guest list. She was cheerful, funny, and had a natural charm that made people smile. She always found a way to bring some lightness into busy or stressful moments. While carrying a box of candles across the hall, Lena noticed a group of volunteers struggling to move something heavy. It was a large old upright piano, covered in dust and wrapped in a faded gray sheet. Someone had written a note on the top with a black marker, "Broken, do not use." Curious, Lena walked over and helped them set it down in one corner of the stage area. "Where did this come from?" she asked, brushing some dust off the piano lid. One of the men laughed. "It's been sitting in the storeroom for years. We thought maybe it could work as decoration, but it's completely out of tune. Half the keys don't even work." Lena tilted her head, looking at it with a grin. "A decoration? That's a shame. It probably made some beautiful music once," he nodded. "Maybe. But now it's just an old box with broken strings." When he walked away, Lena couldn't help standing there for a moment longer. There was something strangely sad about the piano, as if it was quietly waiting for someone to remember it. A few hours passed, and the hall looked ready. Fairy lights hung across the ceiling, the chairs were neatly arranged, and the stage was set for small performances. Mostly kids singing, some people doing comedy, and a few short speeches. The charity event was one of those nights where everyone felt proud to be part of something kind. As the evening drew closer, people started to arrive. Families, neighbors, and even the mayor came to show support. The air smelled of freshly baked pastries and coffee. Kids ran around playing tag near the stage, and their laughter echoed across the hall. Lena was at the entrance, welcoming guests with her warm smile. But as things settled down, she found herself glancing back at the corner where the piano sat. It looked lonely in the shadows, half hidden behind the curtain. Later, when the host announced a short break before the next performance, the lights dimmed slightly. A few people went outside for air, and the hall became quieter. That's when one of Lena's friends jokingly called out to her, "Hey Lena, why don't you play something on that broken piano? Maybe it'll start working again." Lena laughed. "Yeah, right. I'll probably scare everyone away." But as everyone chuckled, she felt a playful spark inside. She wasn't sure why, but something about that idea felt fun. She hadn't played piano in years, not since her high school days, but she still remembered the feeling of her fingers dancing on the keys. Maybe it would be funny to give it a try. She walked over to the piano and wiped off more dust from the lid. "All right, everyone," she said jokingly. "Prepare yourselves for the worst concert of your lives." A few people nearby laughed and turned to watch. Someone even pulled out a phone to record, just for fun. Lena sat down on the worn wooden bench. It creaked under her weight. The keys were yellowed and uneven. Some were chipped, others slightly sunken. She pressed one lightly. It made a soft, hollow sound that seemed to echo differently than she expected. It wasn't perfectly tuned, but it wasn't silent either. "Huh," she muttered, pressing another key, then another. A few of them didn't respond at all. But others did, and surprisingly, they had a deep, almost emotional tone. The small audience chuckled again. But the laughter began to fade as Lena started pressing more keys, just experimenting. There was something about the sound, broken yet strangely beautiful. The notes that worked blended in a way that gave off a haunting, nostalgic feeling. For a moment, Lena forgot about the people watching. Her fingers started to move with more rhythm, finding a small melody between the working notes. She didn't even realize she was remembering a tune she used to play when she was younger. A simple, gentle piece that her old piano teacher loved. The broken instrument responded softly, its imperfections adding texture to the music. The sound wasn't clear or bright. It was raw, like a voice trembling with emotion. The crowd around her stopped whispering. One by one, more people turned their heads toward the corner of the hall. The chatter, the laughter, even the clinking cups at the snack table, all of it slowly faded into silence. Lena's fingers moved carefully, adjusting to the missing notes, finding ways around the broken ones. She smiled a little, lost in the rhythm. Each sound seemed to carry a story. The creak of the bench, the faint buzz of a light above, and that imperfect melody that somehow felt more real than any polished performance. When the last note faded, she lifted her hands gently from the keys. The hall was completely quiet. Nobody clapped immediately. Not because they didn't want to, but because the moment felt too fragile to break. Then someone whispered, "That was beautiful." Applause followed, soft at first, then louder. A few people stood smiling at her with genuine warmth. Lena blinked, surprised. "Wait, I was just joking," she said, half laughing, half blushing. "It's broken." But no one cared that it was broken. The sound had reached them in a way they didn't expect. It was different. Imperfect, yes, but it had heart. A woman came up to her and said, "You made that old piano come alive again." Lena smiled, running her fingers gently across the keys once more. "I didn't think it still had a voice," she said softly. As the host called for the next performance, Lena stood and stepped away. She looked back once at the piano, still half hidden in shadow, but now it didn't look lonely anymore. It looked proud, like it had finally been heard after years of silence. That night people kept talking about her little joke performance. Some said it was the highlight of the evening. Others said they'd never heard anything like it. Lena just laughed every time someone mentioned it, brushing it off as luck. But deep inside, something had shifted. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a quiet connection to that instrument, as if it had been waiting for her to sit down and remind everyone, including herself, that beauty doesn't always come from perfection. Sometimes it comes from what's been forgotten, waiting patiently to be found again. When the event ended and people started cleaning up, Lena walked past the piano once more. The lights were dim now and the hall was nearly empty. She placed her hand gently on its wooden frame. "Thank you," she whispered with a smile. The air was still, but somehow it felt like the piano was listening, like it understood. She turned off the lights, leaving the piano there in the quiet hall, glowing faintly under the last strand of fairy lights. Nobody knew it yet, but that old broken piano had just begun a new story, one that would touch more hearts than anyone could have imagined. The next day, Lena woke up with the memory of the broken piano still fresh in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the way the old instrument had sounded, the way the imperfect notes had somehow carried so much feeling. She hadn't expected it at all. It was supposed to be a joke, a way to make people laugh during the charity event, but instead, it had touched something inside her, and apparently inside everyone else who had been there. She found herself drawn to the hall again. It was still early, and the sunlight poured softly through the tall windows, casting long streaks of light across the empty chairs. The hall smelled faintly of wood polish and dust, a reminder of how many times the space had been used for gatherings like this. Lena walked slowly toward the piano, her steps quiet on the wooden floor. When she reached it, she hesitated for a moment. She was nervous. She wasn't a professional pianist, not anymore. It had been years since she'd taken lessons, and even then she had never played for an audience like that. But the memory of the night before pushed her forward. Somehow she felt the piano was waiting for her again, quietly, patiently, as if it knew she'd come back. She ran her hand over the dusty keys. The cold wood sent a little shiver through her fingers. She pressed a few notes carefully, listening to their uneven but warm tones. She remembered the way people had fallen silent when she played, how the room had seemed to hold its breath. She smiled to herself. Maybe today, she thought, she could try something different. Lena sat down on the creaky bench and let her fingers hover over the keys. She started slowly, just pressing a few random notes, letting the piano respond however it would. The sounds were rough, uneven, but there was something comforting about it. It wasn't perfect, but that imperfection made it alive. As she experimented, she began to recall little melodies she had played as a child. Simple tunes, the ones that had made her feel happy and free. Her fingers moved cautiously at first, testing which keys still worked, which ones made strange but beautiful sounds. Then she began connecting them into something coherent, something that felt like it belonged to the room. She didn't notice the janitor approaching until he cleared his throat softly. Lena looked up, startled, and gave a small laugh. Didn't mean to scare you, he said. He was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold many years of quiet observation. He watched her play for a moment, leaning on his broom. I heard you last night, he said finally. I didn't know an old piano like this still had a voice. Lena smiled, feeling a little embarrassed. I didn't think it did either. I was just trying something, I guess. The janitor nodded slowly, his eyes softening. You didn't just try something. You made it sing, that piano. It belonged to someone very special once. My wife. She played it all the time. It's been years since anyone heard it properly. Lena's fingers froze on the keys. She hadn't expected this. Really? She asked. Yes, he said. She loved this piano. She played for every small gathering, every little event. When she passed away, I couldn't bring myself to throw it out. But it sat in the storage room silent for years. I thought its music was gone forever. Lena's heart tightened. She looked down at her hands resting on the uneven keys. Somehow it felt different now. Heavier, but in a good way. I think it was trying to tell me something last night, she said softly. The janitor smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. Maybe it was waiting for someone who could hear it. Someone who wouldn't be afraid of its flaws. Lena began to play again. This time more carefully, more thoughtfully. She thought about the janitor's wife, about all the years the piano had been silent. Each note she pressed felt like a little thread connecting the past and the present. Some keys made strange hollow sounds while others rang beautifully. She started to realize that the broken notes weren't a problem. They were part of its story. The janitor watched silently, tears glinting in his eyes. Lena didn't notice at first, too focused on coaxing music from the old instrument. She played longer than she intended, letting her hands wander, letting the sound fill the quiet hall. Each time she made a mistake or hit a dead key, she didn't stop. She adjusted, moved around it, made it part of the melody. Somehow, the broken notes made the music more alive. After a while, the janitor spoke again, his voice soft. You have a gift, he said. Not just for playing music, but for finding it where no one expects it. Lena paused and looked up at him. I'm not sure it's a gift, I just liked the way it sounded. He shook his head. No, you understood something that most people miss. Music isn't just about perfection. It's about feeling. That piano, it's been waiting for someone who could hear that. For a moment, Lena didn't respond. She let the words sink in. They were simple, but they carried a weight she hadn't expected. The piano wasn't just an instrument. It was a connection to the past, a vessel of memories, a keeper of emotion. She had stumbled into something bigger than herself without realizing it. When she finally stood up, stretching her stiff arms, she felt a strange sense of fulfillment. The hall was still quiet and the sunlight had shifted, casting warm streaks across the piano. Lena brushed her hands over the keys one last time and smiled. Thank you, she whispered. The janitor nodded. Come back any time, he said. This piano has more stories to tell if you're willing to listen. Over the next few days, Lena couldn't stop thinking about that moment. She started visiting the hall more often, quietly, when no one else was around. She would sit at the piano, experimenting with different melodies, letting the broken notes guide her. Sometimes she would play slowly, softly, as if speaking directly to the instrument. Other times she would play with more energy, exploring rhythms and patterns that made the hall feel alive again. People began to notice. One day a group of children wandered into the hall, curious about the piano. Lena smiled and invited them to sit and watch. She didn't perform for them. She simply played, letting them hear the strange but beautiful music. The children's eyes widened and they leaned closer, listening. A few even tried pressing a key or two, and Lena encouraged them, laughing when the sounds came out wrong. The imperfections didn't matter. They were part of the magic. Word spread quickly through the small town. People who had attended the charity event began talking about the girl who had brought life back to the old piano. Some came to see for themselves, just to witness what everyone described as something special. Lena didn't perform professionally or announce any concerts. She simply played quietly whenever she could, letting the piano's voice reach anyone who cared to listen. One afternoon, the janitor brought in a small notebook he had found tucked away inside the piano bench. These are her compositions, he said softly. Not many of them, but she wrote them by hand. Maybe you'd like to try them. Lena opened the notebook carefully, flipping through pages of handwritten notes. simple melodies filled with emotion. Some were cheerful, some sad, some playful. Each one felt personal, like a message from the past. She realized that the piano had been more than an instrument. It had been a part of someone's life, a companion through joy and sorrow. For Lena, playing the piano was no longer a joke. It was a way to connect, to history, to people, to emotions that words couldn't capture. The broken keys didn't stop her. They challenged her. They forced her to listen, to adapt, to find beauty in imperfection. By the end of that week, Lena had started to feel a strange bond with the piano, stronger than she had felt with anything in a long time. She could sense its personality, the way it responded to her touch, the way its sound shifted depending on how she played. It wasn't perfect, but that imperfection made it unique, alive, and unforgettable. And the more she played, the more she realized that this was only the beginning. That broken piano had stories to tell, and somehow she had become part of its story too. The thought both thrilled and humbled her. She wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but she knew she wanted to see how far it could go, how many hearts it could touch, how many people could hear its voice, even in its broken state. That day, as Lena walked home from the hall, she felt a quiet excitement bubbling inside her. She had started the week thinking it would be just a joke, a small moment of fun, but instead she had discovered something bigger, a reminder that sometimes beauty lives where we least expect it, and that even broken things can create something magical when someone listens carefully enough. And so, the old piano waited, patient and silent for now, but ready to sing again. The days passed quickly, and Lena found herself visiting the old hall more often. Each visit felt like stepping into a world that existed somewhere between memory and music. The hall was quiet during the day, sunlight spilling through tall windows, illuminating the dust particles that floated lazily in the air. It was calm, almost sacred, and Lena felt at peace there. The broken piano sat waiting in its usual corner, its keys still uneven and yellowed with age. Lena ran her fingers across them carefully, remembering the first night she had touched it. Back then, she had intended only a joke, a moment of light-hearted fun. But now every touch felt intentional. She wasn't just playing, she was listening, coaxing the piano to share its stories, its past, and its hidden beauty. She began to explore more complicated melodies this time. The broken keys forced her to think differently, to adapt. When a note failed to sound, she would improvise, weaving the imperfections into the music instead of ignoring them. Each melody became something entirely new, something that belonged not only to her but also to the piano itself. One morning, while Lena was practicing quietly, a few children wandered in from the street. They had been drawn by the sound of music spilling from the open hall door. Lena smiled and waved them in. "Do you want to hear something?" she asked. The children nodded eagerly, their eyes wide with curiosity. She played slowly at first, letting each note linger in the air. The kids sat cross-legged on the floor, listening in awe as the piano sang its imperfect but hauntingly beautiful song. Some of the notes were off, but somehow that made it even more magical. Lena encouraged them to try pressing a key or two. Their tiny hands landed on the keys, producing random sounds that made everyone laugh. Instead of being annoyed, Lena blended their notes into her melody. It was messy, but it was alive, and the children's laughter added an extra layer of joy to the music. After they left, Lena lingered a little longer. She began to notice how much the piano had changed her own approach to music. She had always loved playing when she was younger, but she had been taught to focus on perfection, on flawless technique. Now, with this old, imperfect piano, she realized that music wasn't just about playing the right notes. It was about feeling, about telling a story, about making people feel something even if the melody wasn't perfect. Later that week, the janitor returned carrying a small, dusty photograph. He handed it to Lena. "I found this in the storage room with the piano," he said softly. It was a picture of his late wife sitting at the piano, smiling as she played. She looked happy, free, completely lost in the music. Lena traced the outline of her face with her fingers, feeling a sudden pang of connection. This piano had been a part of her life for so long, holding her memories, her joy, and now it was sharing some of that with Lena. "I feel like it's talking to me," Lena said quietly, not with words but with sound. The janitor nodded, his eyes glistening. "That's exactly it. It always spoke through music. It's just that most people never listen carefully enough. That evening, Lena decided to try something she hadn't attempted before. She sat down at the piano and began to play a melody she remembered from her childhood. It was one she had learned long ago from a teacher who had believed that music could express feelings that words never could. As her fingers moved across the keys, she realized that the broken notes added a depth she had never imagined. Where the notes were uneven or missing, her mind and hands filled in the gaps, creating something entirely new. A music that felt more alive than anything she had played before. Hours passed without her noticing. The hall was empty, but Lena didn't care. She was lost in the music and the dialogue between her and the piano. Every wrong note, every creak of the bench, every subtle difference in tone became part of a conversation. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made it beautiful. One evening, a small group of townspeople came to see what Lena had been doing. They had heard about the girl who had brought the old piano to life. Lena greeted them shyly, but they encouraged her to play. She hesitated at first, but then she realized she didn't need to be perfect for them to enjoy it. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. The hall became quiet, every listener leaning forward slightly, drawn in by the raw emotion of the music. Some notes cracked and wavered, some were faint or slightly off-key, but the overall melody was alive. People whispered to each other, smiling, some even holding back tears. Children sat quietly, mesmerized by the sound. Adults who had been skeptical at first found themselves completely absorbed. When the last note faded, the hall remained silent for a moment. Then slowly, people began to clap, softly at first, then louder and louder. Lena's cheeks turned warm and she smiled nervously, bowing slightly. She realized that she hadn't just played music. She had created a shared experience. In that moment, everyone had felt the story hidden in the piano's imperfections. After the crowd left, Lena stayed behind. She traced her fingers along the keys, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. She understood now that the piano wasn't broken in the way she had first thought. Its imperfection wasn't a flaw. It was its character. Its voice was unique because of the flaws, because of the history it carried. It had lived through decades, through laughter and sadness, through silence and abandonment, and now it was speaking again. A few days later, Lena received a small invitation. The janitor had written her a note. "Come tomorrow evening. I think it's time you hear its story." Curious, Lena returned to the hall. The janitor was waiting, holding a small envelope in his hand. "This belonged to her," he said, handing it to Lena. Inside were sheets of handwritten music, simple compositions she had never seen before. "These are my wife's pieces. She didn't write many, but she poured her heart into each one. I think she would have wanted someone like you to hear them and carry them forward." Lena's hands trembled slightly as she opened the pages. She could feel the emotion behind each note, the care and thought she had once poured into music herself. She realized that this piano and these compositions were more than just memories. They were a bridge, a connection between the past and present, between the life of a woman she had never met and her own. That night, Lena sat at the piano with the sheet music in front of her. She played slowly, following the notes as best she could, improvising where necessary to accommodate the broken keys. Each melody felt like a whisper from the past, a story told without words. She closed her eyes and let the music flow through her, feeling both joy and sadness. The piano wasn't just an instrument. It was a vessel of memory, a keeper of emotion, and she was part of that story now. As she played, Lena noticed something remarkable. The piano responded differently to each touch. Some notes sang clearly, others murmured softly, while a few cracked and hesitated. Instead of frustrating her, these responses inspired her. She learned to weave the imperfections into her music, creating a harmony that was unexpected and alive. By the end of the evening, Lena felt exhausted but fulfilled. She had spent hours listening, playing, and learning from the piano. She realized that this was no longer just a hobby or a simple amusement. It was becoming a part of her life, a way to connect with history, with people, and with herself. For the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of purpose. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't competing or performing for recognition. She was sharing something pure, something real, something that came from the heart. And in return, the piano gave her its voice, imperfect yet perfect in its own way. As Lena left the hall that night, she glanced back at the piano one last time. It sat in the corner, quiet, waiting. She knew she would return soon, that there were more stories to uncover, more music to coax from its keys, and she felt a quiet excitement, a sense that this was only the beginning. The piano, once forgotten and abandoned, had found its voice again, and Lena had found hers. The days that followed were unlike any Lena had experienced before. Each morning she felt a quiet excitement bubbling inside her, knowing she would return to the old hall and sit before the piano. It had become more than an instrument. It was a friend, a confidant, a keeper of stories. Even the creaking of the bench and the uneven keys felt comforting now, like the gentle presence of someone who had been waiting for her all along. One afternoon, Lena arrived at the hall earlier than usual. The sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Dust floated lazily in the air, illuminated by the golden light, making the space feel almost magical. She ran her fingers across the keys and paused, listening to the soft, imperfect notes. The piano seemed alive in a way she had never noticed before, almost as if it were breathing. The janitor appeared quietly, carrying a small stack of papers. He handed them to Lena with a gentle smile. "I think it's time you learn more about its story," he said. Lena's curiosity flared. She had already heard pieces of it about his late wife and the piano's past, but now she wanted to know everything. Sitting down, Lena began to read the papers. They were letters, notes, and a small diary that had belonged to the janitor's wife. Her handwriting was neat but delicate, each word carrying warmth and emotion. Lena realized that the piano had been more than just a hobby for her. It had been a lifeline, a way to express her deepest feelings. As she read, Lena learned about the moments the piano had witnessed. There were letters describing quiet evenings when the town seemed asleep, and she would play for herself, letting the music fill the room and calm her worries. There were notes about parties and small gatherings, where neighbors and friends would gather to hear her play. Sometimes she had played when she was sad, letting her fingers express what words could not. Other times she had played for joy, her laughter mixing with the melody. Each letter Lena read painted a picture of a life lived closely with music. She felt as if she were stepping into the past, walking through the memories of someone she had never met but already felt connected to. The piano wasn't just wood and strings. It was a vessel for human emotion, a witness to both happiness and sorrow. The janitor watched her silently, as if respecting the sacredness of the moment. "She loved it," he said softly. "Even when she wasn't perfect, even when the notes didn't come out right, she never stopped playing." That piano carried everything she felt. It carried her heart. Lena looked up from the papers, her eyes wide. "It's amazing," she whispered. "I feel like I'm hearing her now through the music and her words." The janitor nodded. "That's the gift of music," he said. "It can reach across time, across generations, across people. Sometimes you don't even need to know the person. You just need to listen." Encouraged by the stories she had read, Lena began to play again, this time with a new sense of purpose. She tried the compositions she had seen in the notebook, pieces that had never been performed outside the walls of the house. Some were simple, almost childlike, while others were complex, full of emotion and depth. Lena adapted them to the broken keys, learning to shape the music around the imperfections. Each note felt like a tribute to the woman who had played here before her, a connection that spanned years and experiences. The music drew people in more than ever. The townspeople began to gather outside the hall, curious to hear what Lena had been playing. They had heard rumors about the girl who could make an old broken piano sound alive again, but the stories couldn't capture the truth. When they stepped inside and heard the music for themselves, they were captivated. Some listeners were moved to tears. Others smiled quietly, feeling joy and nostalgia. Children leaned close to the keys, listening intently, while older townspeople closed their eyes, letting the melodies remind them of times long past. The music wasn't perfect. Some notes were cracked or uneven, but that was precisely what made it magical. It carried emotion, history, and heart. One evening, as Lena played softly, the janitor shared more of his memories. He spoke of the first time his wife had touched the piano, how shy she had been as a child, and how she had grown into a confident, passionate musician. He told stories of her laughing during lessons, of her playing for small audiences and bringing smiles to people's faces. Lena listened, absorbing every word. She realized that she wasn't just playing music. She was stepping into someone else's life, honoring a legacy that had been waiting decades to be shared again. Lena began experimenting more boldly. She combined the old compositions with her own improvisations, creating melodies that were entirely new yet connected to the past. The broken keys no longer felt like a limitation. They were part of the challenge, part of the beauty. She discovered that mistakes could be magical, that unexpected notes could lead to ideas she hadn't imagined. Her confidence grew, and she began to play for larger audiences. Small community events were held in the hall, and Lena's music became a central part of them. People came from nearby towns to hear her play, drawn by the stories they had heard about the girl and the piano. The once-forgotten hall was filled with laughter, clapping, and quiet awe. Lena often saw the janitor standing at the back, his eyes shining with pride and quiet joy. Through it all, Lena learned something she hadn't expected. Music could heal. She saw children who had never smiled at a piano become fascinated. She saw older listeners remember loved ones long gone, tears running down their cheeks. She even saw strangers comfort each other in ways words could not. The piano, broken and imperfect, was giving people something far greater than entertainment. It was giving them connection, emotion, and memory. One night after the hall had emptied, Lena stayed behind. She sat in the quiet, running her fingers along the keys, thinking about everything she had learned. The piano had been silent for years, waiting for someone who could listen. She had come here as a joke, as a curiosity, and now she realized she was part of something much bigger than herself. She had become a bridge between the past and the present, between the piano's story and the lives of everyone who heard it. The janitor joined her quietly. "You've brought it back to life," he said softly. "Not just the music, but its spirit. She would have been proud of you." Lena smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "I don't feel like I've done it alone," she said. "The piano. It taught me how to play, how to listen, how to understand. I just followed its lead." The janitor nodded. "Sometimes we just need to be patient and pay attention. Music doesn't always come from perfection. It comes from understanding, from listening, from giving yourself fully to it." That night, Lena left the hall with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She realized that this journey with the broken piano was more than learning music. It was learning life. The piano had taught her about patience, about listening deeply, and about finding beauty where others might only see flaws. The next morning, Lena returned once again. This time she brought her own small notebook, filled with melodies she had composed inspired by the broken piano. She added notes, small sketches of songs, and ideas for new compositions. The old piano would continue to guide her, but now she would also bring her own voice, weaving it into the history it carried. As she sat down and began to play, she felt a connection stretching across time. She was not alone. The janitor's wife, the townspeople, the children, even herself, they were all connected by the music. Each note, whether cracked or clear, told a story. Each melody was a reminder that imperfection did not diminish beauty. It enhanced it. The piano, once forgotten and silent, had become a living memory, a teacher and a friend. And Lena knew that as long as she listened carefully and played with her heart, it would continue to sing for generations to come. The sun was just beginning to set as Lena walked to the hall that evening. The sky glowed in soft shades of orange and pink, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves. Lena felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. Something about tonight felt different. She had been playing the old piano for weeks now, learning its quirks, exploring its history, and sharing its music with others. But tonight she sensed that the piano had a story to tell that went beyond music. She pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside. The hall was quiet, except for the faint sound of the wind brushing against the tall windows. Dust motes danced in the last rays of sunlight, and the piano waited silently in its corner as if expecting her. Lena approached it slowly, her fingers brushing lightly over the keys. They felt familiar now, worn and uneven, yet full of personality. She smiled, remembering how it had first seemed like a joke, a challenge, and now had become a teacher. The janitor was already there, standing in the shadows, watching her quietly. He didn't speak, but Lena could feel his presence as comforting, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had shared over the past weeks. She took a deep breath and sat down at the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys, waiting for inspiration, waiting for the music to come. Then, almost as if it had been waiting for this moment, the piano began to sing. Not in the way Lena expected, not with a rehearsed melody or a simple tune, but in a way that felt alive. The notes were uneven, some cracking slightly, some ringing out clearly. Yet every note carried emotion, joy, sadness, hope, and a deep, timeless beauty. Lena's fingers moved instinctively, following the rhythm, blending her own style with the voice of the piano. As she played, she felt a presence, a gentle warmth that filled the hall. It was as if the piano itself were alive, responding to her touch, guiding her hands, whispering stories from the past. She remembered the notes she had seen in the janitor's wife's notebook, the letters describing quiet evenings, laughter, and tears. She felt them all in the music, as though the woman herself were sitting beside her, smiling, encouraging her. Hours passed without Lena noticing. The hall was bathed in the soft glow of lanterns she had lit to keep the space warm. Shadows stretched across the walls, and outside the night had fallen. Yet inside, the piano's voice seemed to transcend time, carrying memories, emotions, and life itself. The music was imperfect, yes, but that imperfection made it more real, more human, more beautiful. Eventually, a few townspeople arrived quietly, drawn by the sound of music flowing through the streets. They didn't speak, didn't interrupt. They simply sat, listened, and let themselves be carried away by the melodies. Children tiptoed in, curious and wide-eyed, while older listeners leaned against the walls, some holding their hands over their hearts, feeling memories awaken. Every note seemed to touch someone differently, yet everyone felt the same thing: connection, warmth, and the power of something real. The janitor watched from the back of the hall, his eyes glistening. He had seen many people play the piano before, but he had never witnessed something like this. Lena wasn't just playing. She was communicating, telling stories that no one else could hear. She had taken the music from the past, woven in her own experiences, and created something timeless. After a while, Lena paused, allowing a few notes to linger in the quiet hall. She could hear her own breathing, the gentle creak of the bench and the soft hum of the old piano. She smiled softly. "I think I understand now," she said quietly, though no one answered aloud. It's never just about the notes. It's about what they carry, what they share, and how they make people feel. The janitor stepped closer. "You've learned its secret," he said gently. "Music isn't about perfection. It's about life, about emotion, about the stories we carry. Your playing has brought it back to life in a way no one else could." Lena felt a lump in her throat. She thought of the first time she had touched this piano, jokingly pressing keys and expecting nothing. Now it had become a part of her life, a part of her heart. She realized that the piano had not only shared its story, but it had also helped her find her own voice. She had learned patience, empathy, and the courage to create, to share, and to feel deeply. That night, something magical happened. As Lena played a particularly soft and tender melody, the hall seemed to come alive. The notes lingered in the air longer than usual, wrapping around the listeners like a warm embrace. Some listeners closed their eyes, lost in the music. Children rested their heads on their parents' laps, soothed by the gentle tones. The older townspeople exchanged quiet smiles, remembering loved ones or moments from their own past. The music was more than sound. It was connection, memory, and love made tangible. When the last note faded, the hall remained still for a moment. Then slowly people began to clap, softly at first, then louder, until the hall echoed with applause and cheers. Lena's cheeks warmed and she gave a small, shy bow. The janitor smiled at her from the back, proud and emotional. Lena realized that she had not just played music, she had shared a piece of herself, and in return, the piano and the stories it carried had touched everyone in that room. Later, as the hall emptied, Lena stayed behind. She ran her fingers over the keys one last time, feeling their imperfections and their warmth. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Thank you for trusting me with your story." The piano seemed to respond with a soft, lingering note as if acknowledging her words. She looked around the hall, imagining all the people who had passed through these doors, all the stories the walls had witnessed, and she realized something important. The piano had been waiting for someone who could listen with the heart, someone who could transform brokenness into beauty. And in that process, Lena herself had changed. She had become more patient, more compassionate, more attuned to the quiet magic in everyday life. The janitor joined her again, holding the small notebook of compositions. She would have been happy to see this, he said, to know that her music lives on, that someone listens and understands, that it continues to touch hearts. Lena nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. She carefully placed her own notebook next to the old compositions, imagining future generations who might one day sit at this piano and feel the same connection she had felt. The hall, the piano, and the music would continue to tell stories, bridging the past and the present, teaching patience, empathy, and the courage to feel deeply. As Lena left the hall that night, the moonlight shimmered across the street. She looked back one last time, the old piano sitting quietly in its corner. She smiled. She knew that this was not the end of the journey. There were more stories to discover, more music to create, more hearts to touch, and she felt a sense of peace, knowing that even imperfections could carry the most perfect kind of beauty. From that day on, Lena continued to visit the hall, always learning, always listening. She became known in the town not just as a musician, but as someone who could connect with others through music, someone who understood that every note, every pause, and every imperfection could carry emotion, history, and life. The old piano, once broken and forgotten, had become a living testament to the power of listening, of patience, and of the human heart. And in the quiet moments, when the hall was empty, Lena would sit and play, hearing both the past and the future in every note. She had started as a girl making a joke with a broken piano, and she had grown into a storyteller, a bridge, and a witness to the magic that music, even imperfect music, can carry. The piano had left everyone speechless once, and now it continued to speak, not in words, but in feeling, in connection, and in the timeless beauty of its sound. And in that music, Lena found herself, the town found its memories, and the piano found its voice again, forever alive.